Welcome to Advice for Grad Students. I'm your host, Phil Haun. I'm a MIT SSP alum, and I am really happy to be joined today with Peter Krause, a fellow alum and associate professor at Boston College. I'll say up front that the what we talk about today are ours and do not necessarily express those of our institutions. So, Peter, welcome to Advice for Grad Students.
Thanks so much for having me, Phil. An honor to be here. An honor to be engaging again with the MIT community.
All right, great. Well, the topic today is turning the dissertation into a book. So, why did you pick this topic to talk about?
Yeah, I think it's something that, again, I don't think too many people think fondly necessarily of the process of fully writing their dissertation, fully revising into a book. It's certainly one of the most difficult things that I think many of us go through as a scholar, but it is something that I actually enjoyed at many parts of the process. And I think I have some interesting insights to help current grad students as they start to think about this stuff in the latter stages of their time getting their PhD.
Okay, well, let's get right into it. I'm looking forward to whatever comments you have to help make my book writing process better as well. So, have at it.
All right. Well, the first thing I'll say is that I know the topic is turning a dissertation into a book, but in my opinion, this process actually starts while you're a grad student, even before you finish this dissertation. Now, I know that dissertations have changed a little bit since you and I were in grad school, where it used to be most people, if not everyone, was going to write a quote unquote book dissertation. And I think many people still do, but you have a growing number of students or programs that say, hey, maybe we want you to do a 3-article dissertation, right? So that's a little bit different. But I'll be speaking mostly for people trying to turn it into a book, which I still think is probably the majority of students, especially those at MIT, although there's some variation there. Now, when you're thinking about this stuff, what I would say first and foremost is think about writing your dissertation like a book in terms of how you structure it. So if you start writing a dissertation in terms of the various chapters, the way you set it up, having a theory chapter, having empirical chapters, etc., you're already ahead of the game in terms of how you're structuring it. So that's step one. But step two is your defense. I think a lot of people obviously have a lot of anxiety about their dissertation defense. It's like, oh, this is the final stage before I get my PhD and I finish. One of the things that hopefully you'll learn if you don't know already is that your committee will pretty much never let you get to your defense unless you're ready to kind of pass it. With that knowledge in mind, it's not like you should laze into the defense and not work hard, et cetera, but you should see it as an opportunity for you to have it as your basically first book conference, where all of the comments you're getting from your committee at that point, don't think about them as, oh, these are the final critiques I need to pass my PhD. Think of it as, these are now critiques and suggestions I can use to start turning this dissertation into a book. And you should explicitly frame some of this stuff in that way. If your committee members are not framing some of their critiques in that way, you should explicitly ask at some point in your defense, I want to make this into a book. What particular suggestions would you have for me to be able to do so? And some of it will be stuff that they've already said, but I guarantee you they'll also have great advice in that defense about how to turn into a book. So that's kind of step one. While you're still a grad student, before you even finish your PhD, I think there's a lot of things you can do to turn the dissertation into a book. Now, once you graduate, hopefully, and get your PhD, right? Many people say the best dissertation is a finished dissertation, right? And there's some truth to that, right? You want to get it done. But for many of us, whether you're going into academia or going to a think tank or otherwise, we want to turn this into something. And so turning it into a book, I think, requires a few steps and a few things to know about the actual process. So first most common step that many people have to undergo. When you write your dissertation, you often have this big section or even a whole chapter. I've even seen 2 chapters of a literature review. Now, that's a necessary part of the process, right? When you're a graduate student, you have to read and learn a great deal about everything that's been written on your topic before. That's somewhat of a rite of passage. It's also why looking up dissertations on a topic you're trying to study is a great way to go, because if that person's done their job, they've covered a lot of the ground of what's there. It's not that that doesn't have a place in your book. It's just one of the first things that book publishers will say to you is, yeah, let's like lop off that lit review chapter, or let's integrate it into a theory chapter or introduction. Why? Because you're not just writing for your committee now. You are writing for a broader audience, at least of political scientists, if not the general public, policymakers, et cetera. And they don't want to slog through 50 pages of who said what and he said, she said, they said, et cetera. So find and think about ways that you can utilize your lit review to integrate it into your new book, but not as this massive standalone chapter. I'll also say, by the way, and I'll come back to this in just a moment, One of the things you can do with it is turn it into an article. My most cited article I ever had was basically the lit review section from my dissertation that didn't actually fully fit into the book. And so I lopped it off and made it a standalone article. And so that's a great thing you can think about as you're transitioning your dissertation, not just into a book, but into something else as well. Second point, writing in plain language. Now, again, there's always going to be some jargon in people's first books. It's the nature of the beast in political science. But more and more, think about how can you get your points across with language that your parents or your friends or your roommates would understand. That's something that makes a good dissertation as well, but it especially makes a good book that's going to reach a broader audience. So think about just the language that you're writing as you're transitioning, because again, your audience is no longer 3 or 4 faculty members. It's hopefully thousands of people in the broader community. Okay, next, I just mentioned this, but thinking about parts of the book to turn into an article. So one could be a fully separate article like I talked about. Okay, this lit review section is not going to go in my book, boom. Hopefully that can be a review article somewhere else. But also, quite commonly, people will take maybe a core part of their theory and maybe a piece of their empirical research, and they'll submit it as a journal article. Many MIT SSP students have done this, sending their journal articles to international security, security studies, journal of strategic studies, etc. And I'll tell you, I did that. And that process was probably the most helpful thing for me writing a book. Now, why is that? Because going through the review process for that journal article, which has a lot of the core pieces of your book, forces you through that very tough review process to change, improve, rethink the stuff in your dissertation that you thought was quote unquote done, but really was not done. And so now after you do that article, which is maybe the first thing you do after you leave grad school, you come back to your book with kind of fresher eyes, having worked on a related project. So I really encourage people to do that. Some people don't. There've been great people from this program who have just immediately done the book right after grad school, but many people have done kind of one article. And I wouldn't suggest doing more than that, because if you start to try to do 2 or 3 articles, then the book publisher is going to say, I don't want to publish this. It's already all out here in the public sphere, right? So one article is often accepted. In many ways, the book publishers may be like that because it demonstrates the quality of your broader project and the fact that it can be published, it is, valued by others, etc. Okay, a few other things. Book conferences. Now, I mentioned that your kind of dissertation defense is, in many ways, you should think of it as your first book conference, but you should try to have another one. Depending on where you are, sometimes your university or fellowship or whatnot might fund a book conference for you. But even if they don't, say if you're lucky enough to be in a city like Boston, there are so many people here who can easily take an Uber or a taxi ride or whatever, or you can do it on Zoom, where basically people are going to read your book manuscript and they're going to give you feedback for, half a day or a day on it. And a lot of people say, like, after the book conference, you cry, you feel like you had this thing you worked on your whole graduate dissertation, you revised it, and now you get all these scholars who are experts in certain areas or certain parts of your theory, and they're just going at you. But in general, if they're good people, and hopefully they are because you select them, they're doing it in a constructive way that's going to have you put that manuscript into top shape before you then ship it off to the university press that you're trying to publish it at. And that will make it much more likely that it will be accepted, which of course is what you want, and that the review process at the press isn't going to be too burdensome. So now we come to kind of the final piece I want to talk about, which is the press and the timeline. So again, there's all kinds of presses. There's trade presses, there's university presses, etc. Many folks with their first book are aiming for a university press, especially if you're trying to get tenure in academia. That's often something that university and tenure committees look for, whether it's, Cornell or Oxford or Cambridge or Columbia. There's lots of great university presses out there. So you want to think both about the quality and the reputation in the field, but also the reputation of the editors who work there. Are they people who are easy to get along with and work with? Are they timely in getting your revisions or reviews back to you? All that stuff is really important, because this is not like a dissertation committee where it's like, okay, you have your advisor and they're really supposed to be getting stuff back to you. And of course, sometimes maybe they take a little delay, but they're mostly pretty good. There are situations with books where you can send it off and maybe you don't hear something for a year. And that can be really frustrating, especially if you're coming up for review for tenure or things like this. So you want to think about not only the press you're applying to, but also your timeline. Generally leaving at least like 2 years from when you're going to submit the book to when you're going to have it published is a good way to go, maybe even a little longer in kind of COVID times. But again, thinking about the timeline and the press is really important, and talking to colleagues, right? Talk to people who just publish books with all of these presses you're thinking about, ask them about their experience. That's going to be the best type of intelligence you can get about the type of press that's going to be right for you thematically with the people, etc. The final thing I'll say is when you finally get that hard copy of your first book, I don't have children yet, but it's like holding your first child. And Phil has children, so maybe he can compare it. But it's an amazing thing. So I know it's a slog. I know it's a difficult thing. But if you follow some of these steps that I talked about, I'm sure others will talk about as well. It really is an amazing thing when you have that. It made me understand the saying that many professional athletes say, which is they can never take that away from me. Now, some book reviewers may try to take it away from you later, but that's a story for another time. In any case, it's a wonderful thing. It's a great process. Best of luck with it.
Oh, Peter, what a great interview. You jam-packed so many things in there, and you answered almost every question that I have, that we're just going to leave it at that. All right. Anyway, Peter, thank you so much for your time on Advice to Grad Students.